This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order every card in this set review by going to cardkingdom.com/needsahone or by following the link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Needsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Brothers War Limited set review. So far we've looked at all the multicolored, colorless white, blue, and black cards, and today we're continuing with red. In these videos, I discuss how good I think these new cards are going to be in the limited format. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you aren't sure what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you'll find an explanation. Before we take a look at the first red card, a few reminders. This video is about limited. That means draft and sealed. This means that I'm only going to be reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing in the new format, and that means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions. Every format is different, and as I play this format, I'll be providing updates about it on the channel. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's dive into the review. First up, it's Arms Race, which for 3 generic into red is an uncommon enchantment. You can pay 3 generic into red and put an artifact card from your hand onto the battlefield. That artifact gains haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next in step. This artifact-only version of Sneak Attack is kind of cool, and this format certainly has some beefy artifact creatures that you can cheat into play, like basically everything with Prototype. However, it's hard to take full advantage of a card like this in Limited, as you often find yourself going down cards in order to do some damage or get your creature chump locked, and that's not usually worth it. You also invest a total of 8 mana to cheat your first thing into play, and that's not exactly a great deal. You need a few things to happen to make this worth playing. You probably need payoffs for sacrificing things, big artifact creatures to cheat into play, and things that give you value when they enter the battlefield or die, and having all of that work out in a limited deck, whether it's draft or sealed, is just going to be very hard. There is some potential here, but it's just not going to work out consistently. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Bitter Reunion, which for 1 generic and a red is a common enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards, and you can pay 1 and sacrifice it, and creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So this is a neat take on a Tormented Voice type effect. While the blue-red deck in this format cares about spells, it actually cares about all non-creature spells, so this will trigger the same sorts of things that Tormented Voice would. The ability to give haste to your whole board comes up on occasion too, though it's not always going to matter. I think you probably cut this most of the time in any deck that doesn't care about spells, and even in the spell deck, it probably isn't the card you're happily shoving in your deck. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Brotherhood's End, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery, and it says choose one. Brother's End deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker, or destroy all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. This looks pretty good, as each of these modes can decimate a decent chunk of decks in the format. Clearing out a bunch of small creatures is going to feel good against the aggressive decks like blue-white and red-white, and blowing up cheap artifacts, including Power Stones and all the creature tokens in the format, or at least almost all of them, is going to be nice too. Obviously, you want this more in a deck where you can always choose a mode that is fairly one-sided, but the fact that you have an option between these two means you can always choose the one that hurts you less. This looks nice. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Conscripted Infantry, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/1 human soldier at common. When it dies, it creates a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature token. A 3-mana 3/1 is not a good rate, but this one leaves behind a 1/1 when it dies, and that means it's going to be good sacrifice fodder, and it's just reasonable value for the cost anyway. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Draconic Destiny, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a mythic rare enchantment aura with enchant creature. The enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has flying, haste, and 1 generic. This creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. It's a dragon in addition to its other types. And when the enchanted creature dies, return Draconic Destiny to its owner's hand. This looks great. It gives an amazing boost to a creature, making virtually anything into a threat, and the fact that it returns to your hand when the creature dies helps you get around the dangerous downside auras usually have. This isn't quite Rancor, though. It only returns to your hand when the creature dies, not when this aura goes to the graveyard in general. So you still have to worry about your opponent removing the creature in response to you targeting your creature, but it's not that hard to find a window where that works out. You know, just putting this on your 2-drop on turn 3 is going to be the kind of thing that is a real headache for your opponent, and it will often just win you the game as it just keeps coming back to your hand and making all of your creatures better. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Dwarven Forge Chanter, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/3 dwarf wizard at common. It has ward, pay 2 life, and it has prowess. This looks nice. Back in Khans of Tarkir, there was a white 2-mana 1/3 with prowess, and it was a solid common. So adding ward, pay 2 life, 2 that also makes for a pretty sweet card. A creature with prowess is already really obnoxious to block or attack into since you never know what your opponent might be able to do. The threat of activation is very real. This is a great 2-drop for the blue-red decks, and lots of other red decks in the format will have enough non-creature spells to have a good time with this too. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Excavation Explosion, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. Deals 3 damage to any target. Create a tapped Power Stone token. A Power Stone token is an artifact with tap, add colorless. This mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. This looks great even as a sorcery. 3 mana to do 3 to anything is always nice. You can usually break even or better on the mana you spend, and this gives you some mana back in the form of that Power Stone. And there's lots of ways to utilize those Power Stones in the format, giving this a B-. Next up, it's the Fall of Krug, which for 4 generic and 2 red is an uncommon sorcery. It says choose target opponent. Destroy target land that player controls. The Fall of Krug deals 3 damage to that player and 1 damage to each creature they control. As usual, land destruction is just bad and limited. There aren't enough powerful non-basics around, so you find yourself just destroying a regular land, and doing that for 6 mana is awful. Even when you add this other value in, which can kill X1s and lightning bolt your opponent in the face, this is still something that you're just not going to want to play. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's Philology Chain Dancer, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/4 human soldier at common, and you can pay 2 generic to give it double strike until end of turn. So this is going to be obnoxious to block on a lot of boards, as a 2/4 double striker can deal with a whole lot of creatures without going down itself. The threat of activation will get this in for 2 a decent chunk of the time, and if you have other ways to augment it, it can get really silly. Power Stones will make this ability easier to activate than you might think too. I think this is a C. Next, it's Feldon Ronom Excavator, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 legendary human artificer at rare. It's got haste, it can't block, and when it's dealt damage, exile that many cards from the top of your library, choose one of them. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. This is a cool design. A 2 mana 2/2 with haste is probably a C+. Taking away blocking brings that down to a C, but this has some nice upside. When your opponent can't do anything but trade with it, they will definitely just take 2 damage. Otherwise, you're getting 2 for 1 when they trade. Once they can block it without losing a creature, they will, but you're still going to get some pretty nice card selection and effectively let you draw a card. The real sweet thing is to find a way for it to take damage and survive. This can be accomplished by using tricks and things like that. And that's when it will feel the silliest, though don't count on setting that up all the time. Basically, though, you can always attack with this and get something out of it, whether your opponent takes 2 or blocks it to kill it. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Giant Cindermaw, which for 2 generic and a red is a 4/3 dinosaur beast at uncommon. It's got trample, and players can't gain life. A 3 mana 4/3 with trample is a great rate, and shutting down life gain matters a little bit in this format, though there's not a full-blown life gain deck that it can just shut down. I wish there were, but there's not. Still, this is a B-. Next, it's Goblin Blast Runner, which for 1 red is a 1/2 goblin at common. It gets +2/+0 and has menace as long as you sacrificed a permanent this turn. This is a nice sacrifice payoff at common. A 3/2 with menace can swing effectively for a pretty long time, and sometimes it will just get bigger. At the same time, it will also be a 1/2 a decent chunk of the time, and that's not so good. The good news is the black-red deck is very into sacrificing stuff, and this will be the kind of card that you play as a 1-drop in that deck all the time. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Horned Stone Seeker, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 lizard at uncommon. It's got menace. When it enters the battlefield, you create a tapped Power Stone, and when it leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice a Power Stone. A 2 mana 2/2 with menace is a nice rate, and the fact this hooks you up with a Power Stone is big upside, even if you do have to give up a Power Stone when it goes down. Sometimes you'll actually be able to get upside out of having to sacrifice a Power Stone because there are payoffs in the format for sacrificing things. But either way, this is a highly efficient creature that can ramp your mana, and sometimes will sort of do something good for the sacrifice deck. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Mechanized Warfare, which for 1 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment. If a red or artifact source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +1 instead. So there's a few cards in this set that want you to lean into a more monocolored direction, and this is one of those. The nice thing about this kind of card is that on a lot of boards, it does actually impact things right away, as it makes all of your red and artifact creatures into significantly better attackers and blockers. You won't always have a board that can take advantage of this right away, and if you aren't a heavy red and or artifact deck, this won't be worth your time. This is probably a D+ in your typical sort of 2-color red deck in the format, but I think it could get as high as a B if you end up being a predominantly red deck, and by predominantly red, I mean like 13, 14 mountains, and maybe only a few cards that aren't red or artifacts. Next up, it's Mishra, Excavation Prodigy, which for 2 generic into red is a 2/1 legendary creature, Human Artificer at uncommon. He's got haste, you can pay 1 and tap him to discard a card and draw a card. And whenever you discard 1 or more artifact cards, add 2 red. This ability triggers only once each turn. Looting is always a nice thing to have around in Limited. It improves the quality of your draws, and Mishra here pays you off a little bit for discarding artifacts since he can give you mana back. I'm not sure how often that's going to be optimal, but it is nice to have the option, and, you know, Unearth is in the set, and sometimes discarding the card and getting the Unearth value back later is pretty good. The stat line's not great. It is going to die to 1 mana removal spells, which hurts a little bit, but it does have haste, which often means you'll get something out of it before your opponent can kill it. I'm giving him a C+. Next up, it's Mishra's Command, which is X and a red for a rare sorcery. It says choose 2, choose target player. They may discard up to X cards, then they draw a card for each card discarded this way. This spell deals X damage to target creature. This spell deals X damage to target planeswalker. Target creature gets +X+0 and gains haste until end of turn. If it was always just an X spell that would hit any creature, it would be a B-, and that kind of effect, while never feeling efficient, does scale all game long, which makes up for that. And yeah, you'll almost always want to choose the removal option, because that's what's going to give you the most value, but you also get to have one whole other effect. Most of the time, the Planeswalker part won't matter in Limited, but the other 2 modes do matter. Buffing one of your creatures or reloading your hand can be pretty darn nice. If you just imagine that this is always doing X damage to a creature and giving you one of those other effects, you're talking about something very powerful. And you get options. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Mishra's Domination, which for 1 generic and a red is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. As long as you control enchanted creature, it gets +2/+2, otherwise it can't block. This is kind of a neat design. We've seen auras in the past that allow you to give your creature +2/+2 and it can't block, and you could use those auras sometimes to put on your opponent's thing so it couldn't block, and very rarely would that actually matter, but sometimes it would allow you to get in for lethal. This is cool because it takes away the downside from when you put it on your creature, and gives your opponent that downside when you put it on their creature without getting the upside. It's still not amazing, but 2 mana for +2/+2 on a creature is often a pretty impressive boost, and there's going to be times where playing this and making something unable to block works out decently enough. I think it's probably going to be at its best in a spell deck where you have your prowess triggers happening, and you also like sort of getting a blocker out of the way at the same time. I think this is probably a C-. I mean, it's nothing amazing, and you probably don't play it all that often outside of blue-red, but I think running 1 in that kind of deck is fine. Next up, it's Mishra's Onslaught, which for 3 generic and a red is a common instant. It says choose 1, create 2 1/1 colorless soldier artifact creature tokens, or creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. You're significantly overpaying for both modes on this card. Usually, each of these effects costs 3. Sometimes you can make 2 1/1 soldiers for 2 mana, in fact. You do get modality here, of course, but the token effect is underpowered and the mass pump effect is fairly narrow, so I don't love this. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Monastery Swift Spear, which for 1 red mana is a 1/2 human monk at uncommon. It's got haste and prowess. This is going to be a big deal in Standard. It was last time, and he's playing a whole bunch of other formats too. That said, it's not nearly as good in Limited. It just isn't that easy to load up on enough spells to trigger it and a bunch of other cheap aggressive creatures. It's just not going to work out that way. And has diminishing returns as the game goes on because its stat line becomes less and less relevant. That said, it's not bad. I just don't want you to think of it as the best 1-drop in the format the way it very well might be in Standard. That said, it's still really good. You play it on turn 1, it gets in for some damage, and then it can threaten to grow all game long, at least allowing it to be somewhat relevant. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Obliterating Bolt, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. This is premium removal. 2 mana for 4 damage is a great deal, as it always is, and the exile clause carries real value in this format. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Over the Top, which for 5 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery. Each player reveals a number of cards from the top of their library equal to the number of non-land permanents they control, puts all permanent cards they revealed this way onto the battlefield, and puts the rest into the graveyard. This isn't good for limited. You can try and have more non-land permanents than your opponent when you cast this so that in theory you come out ahead. However, having that sort of control over a game isn't that easy, and even if you get more permanents, your opponent might still actually get better permanents. It's just too random and not the kind of thing you want to be doing if you're trying to win the game consistently. This is an F. Next, it's Pendragon Strongbow, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 Minotaur at common. You can pay 1 and sack an artifact, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn and deals 1 damage to each opponent. This looks really sweet. There are plenty of artifacts to sacrifice, including the Power Stones that can help pay for the ability too, which kind of makes this say sacrifice a Power Stone. This gets +1/+1 and deals 1 damage to each opponent. That ability is just very affordable in the format, and this creature attacking with a few artifacts in play is going to be a problem. I love that it also damages the opponent, so that means at times where your opponent lets the damage through, every artifact you sacrifice is going to add 2 damage, and that is pretty beastly. I'm sort of tempted to go all the way up to a B- on this one because I think you'll have enough Power Stones to fuel this really effectively, but I think it's probably a little worse than that, and I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Pyrrhic Blast, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. As an additional cost to cast it, sack a creature. It deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target, draw a card. This is a cool design. We see these sacrifice effects a lot, and they're usually kind of a pain to use since you 2-for-1 yourself. But this gets around that by replacing itself with a card draw effect. You can also hit any player with it so it can finish someone off, which is pretty cool. Now, it still does require some setup that is surprisingly awkward. Like, you need a creature with high enough power or some sacrifice synergy, or this falls very flat. It is an instant, so you can use it in response to removal, which is usually where it's going to feel the most powerful. But you still need situations to line up just right. You have to have the mana up, and you have to have a creature that's big enough. The fact it replaces itself does make it better than basically any other version of this effect we've ever seen, but it's probably still just a C. Next up, it's Razed to the Ground, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It can't be countered. It says destroy target artifact. If its mana value is 1 or less, draw a card. This format has a lot of artifacts, so this will often have a target, many of which will be creatures, and it's also nice that it can draw you a card when it hits a cheap artifact. So typically, you'll probably have a Power Stone, either one you have or your opponent has, to target, and that will sort of make it feel like you can cycle this. But this is still a little overcosted and clunky to be that great. 3 mana to kill only 1 permanent type, even one that's relatively plentiful in the set, just isn't that good of a rate. The uncounterable clause really won't come up that much either. I mean, I don't think this is bad at all, but I think some people are going to see this and think of it as premium removal, but it's still restrictive enough at sorcery speed that I don't think it's that. I think the first copy is a C+, it does have diminishing returns after that. Next up, it's Rock Hunter, which for 1 generic and a red is a 3/1 human soldier at common. It's got reach. This has stats that tend to play reasonably well in aggro decks in most formats, although the plentiful 1/1 tokens in this set may hold it back a little. Adding reach to the mix is actually pretty nice, as it means this does a decent job of trading with flyers later in the game after it can no longer attack. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Sardian Cliff Stomper, which for 1 generic and a red is a 0/4 Minotaur Barbarian at uncommon. As long as it's your turn and you control 4 or more mountains, it gets +X+0, where X is the number of mountains you control. This isn't very impressive to me, even if you end up in mono red, and it's pretty much unplayable if you're not in mono red or almost mono red. Sure, its power can get high, but without evasion to take advantage of it, I'm not that excited about all the work you have to do to get it there. And sure, it only costs 2 mana, but the fact it only starts doing its thing once you have 4 mountains is a pretty massive hurdle if you're playing a typical 2-color deck. I think it's an F in your typical red 2-color deck in the format, and a C in a deck is heavy red. Next up, it's Sibling Rivalry, which for 3 generic and a red is a common sorcery. Gain control of target artifact or creature until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste until end of turn. Create a tapped Power Stone token. This format does have a real sacrifice deck in it, meaning that Sibling Rivalry is going to be pretty well positioned, as the best thing to do with these kinds of cards is steal an opposing creature, or artifact in this case, and sacrifice it to one of your sacrifice outlets. This also gives you a Power Stone, which gives you something else to sacrifice later on in many cases. This is definitely a build around, as it isn't very good in just any deck in the format. You know, people end up trying to play these in just like any aggro deck, And, you know, sometimes it feels pretty good and it does the thing you want it to, but it gets stuck in your hands so much because it's basically useless until you're able to kill your opponent. And that makes it a pretty bad draw for most of the game. So it's just really an F in a deck that's not the black-red sacrifice deck, and a C+ in that deck, which is a pretty big difference. Next up, it's Tamakul Scrapsmith, which for 2 generic into red is a human artificer at common. It's a 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards. You may put an artifact card from among the cards milled this way into your hand. If you don't, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So you either get a 3 mana 3/2 or a 3 mana 2/1 that draws you an artifact. Obviously, the latter option is the better one, and this would be at least a C+, probably just a B- if that's what it always was. But it will only do that like half the time, and the 3/2 option isn't that great. It also takes a bit of a hit because red's not very interested in the graveyard in this set. So you don't get that much extra value out of loading the graveyard with this card, apart from the fact that you want to draw an artifact off of the mill trigger. I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Tyrant of Care Ridges, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a 4/5 dragon at rare. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to any target, and you can pay 1 red to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. So take away the enter the battlefield ability, and this card's a B. Decent flying stats and fire breathing make it a formidable finisher, and that enter the battlefield ability is incredible. It will either kill a creature or help you finish off the opponent, and both are amazing. Basically, this is a 2-for-1 that has a massive impact on the board right away. It's something your opponent has to kill or they're going to die, and usually, even if they can kill it, they've already lost something else. So they're coming out really far behind, or just dying to this in the air. This is a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Unleash Shell, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a common instant. It deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, and 2 damage to that permanent's controller. 5 mana is a lot for removal, but at least this is an instant, and it can deal with most creatures in the format too, and, you know, shocking your opponent in the face when you use this is definitely some decent additional upside. The problem with paying 5 for this effect is you'll often have to use it on a creature that costs less, and you lose some serious tempo when you have to do that, and sometimes you just can't get the mana to deal with cheap creatures early, and that's a problem too. I don't really think you want more than one of these most of the time, even in the spell deck, because they're so expensive, but I think the first copy should be valued reasonably highly as a C+. Next, it's Visions of Phyrexia, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. At the beginning of your end step, if you didn't play a card from exile this turn, create a tapped Power Stone token. Drawing an extra card every turn is great, and that's basically what this does, and I like that you get a Power Stone if you hit something you can't cast. It's also kind of cool, the turn you play it, you're at least going to get the Power Stone because chances are you didn't play anything from exile because this wasn't under your control during your upkeep. So while it doesn't really add to the board right away, it does give you a Power Stone right away, and that's something. You know, these sorts of enchantments that don't really add to the board always are a little bit scary to play, but this is one where it's worth taking that risk because if you're allowed to untap within a couple of turns, this will give you an insurmountable advantage, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Whirling Strike, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 and gains first strike and trample until end of turn. This is a solid trick as it will usually keep your creature alive, kill the opposing creature, and even do some trample damage. The one downside, you know, these days, the tricks that end up playing the best are the ones that can also save your creature from removal. This doesn't really do that, but it also gets a bump in this set because of prowess and other spell payoffs. So I think it's a C. All right, now we're moving into the artifacts with red identities. The first of these is Blitz Automaton, which for 7 generic is a 6/4 with haste. It's an artifact creature construct at common, and it has Prototype, which means you can pay an alternate cost to have it come into play with a different size and color and mana cost, but it keeps its abilities. In this case, you can pay 2 generic and a red to get a 3/2. So a 3 mana 3/2 with haste is right around a C-, so adding the more expensive upside of this being a 6/4 with haste sometimes is nice. Don't get too hung up on the efficiency of these kinds of things. Yes, it matters. If this was really efficient, it would be better, but the fact that you have this modality is a big deal. If you play this early, it's perfectly solid, and then if you draw it late and you have the mana to sink into it, you're just going to be pretty happy that you can play this as a much larger creature and not only as the smaller Prototype. And that's kind of how all of these cards work out. Power Stones, of course, also make it easier to just cast this the regular way. Well, and as a Prototype, but getting to 7 mana is what I mean is easier. Overall, I think having the option between these two sort of unimpressive creatures when you think about how much mana you're spending, I think the option between them is a C. Next up, it's Philology Dragon Engine, which for 8 generic is a 5/5 artifact creature dragon at uncommon. It's got flying, and you can pay 2 generic, and it gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and it has prototype, and you can pay 2 generic and a red for it to be a 1/3. So a 3-mana 1/3 that can raise its power like this is probably a C, especially in a set that cares about artifacts, and an 8-mana 5/5 flyer with this ability is probably like a D. But a card that can be either of those things, once again, is significantly better, especially in a set that has Power Stones. I think this comes out as a C+ in the end. Next up, it's Heavyweight Demolisher, which for 7 generic is an 8/6 artifact creature constructed uncommon. It's got Menace, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you tap it unless you pay 3 generic, and it has Unearth for 6 generic and 2 red, which means you can return it from the graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, and you exile it at the beginning of the next instep, or if it would leave the battlefield. Unearth only as a sorcery. A 7-mana 8/6 with Menace is no joke, but this isn't so good that I love the fact that it punishes you by making you pay 3 mana just to untap it. The Unearth upside is sweet, of course, as your opponent has to account for it or end up dying in the late game in many situations, but the untapped tax is enough for me to really feel like I won't always be happy about playing this. It does get better in a set with Power Stones because not only can you cast this with Power Stones, you can pay for its tax with Power Stones. I think it comes out as a C+ in the end. I think this card is going to play better than it looks just because of the Power Stone and artifact upside. Next up, it's Mishra's Juggernaut, which for 5 generic is a common artifact creature Juggernaut. It's a 5/3, it has trample, it attacks each combat if able, and it has Unearth for 5 generic and a red. This is a fun reference to the original Juggernaut, which was a powerhouse in its own day. Unfortunately, I don't think this card is a powerhouse. A 5-mana 5/3 with trample that always has to attack is a D, maybe a D+ at best. It's just going to die to so many things, even if it gets in for a little bit of damage. Adding Unearth is some pretty real upside, though, as a 5/3 with trample is the kind of creature where you're like, yeah, I've got 6 mana lying around, I may as well bring this thing back and swing at my opponent. It's the kind of thing your opponent can't just feel completely unconcerned about in a lot of situations. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Mishra's Research Desk, which for 1 generic is an uncommon artifact. You can pay 1, tap it, and sacrifice it to exile the top 2 cards of your library. Choose one of them until the end of your next turn. You may play that card. And it has Unearth for 1 generic and a red. This is kind of cool as it's an artifact that does draw you 2 cards, which, yeah, that's a 2-for-1. The problem is when you unearth it and sacrifice it, you do end up paying 3 mana up front, which reduces the number of things you can actually play with it. It's also not the worst as sacrifice fodder. You know, in some situations, you can sacrifice it early to something for value, unearth it, and then sacrifice it again. In a lot of ways, this is like a roundabout way to cast Divination in red. It does have better card selection than Divination, but it's also more expensive. It's probably just a C. Next up, it's Scrapwork Mutt, which for 2 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature dog at common. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard a card, and if you do, draw a card. It has an Unearth for 1 generic and a red. A 3-mana 2/1 that rummages when it enters the battlefield is like a D+ these days. Adding Unearth to the mix is real upside though, since you get this Enter the Battlefield ability all over again. You can potentially sacrifice it to something. Maybe it just gets in for 2 damage. Whatever it is, it's giving you something when you unearth it, and I like that. I think this is a C. And our last card for this video is Skitterbeam Battalion, which for 9 generic is a 4/4 artifact creature construct at Mythic Rare. It has trample and haste, and when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you create 2 tokens that are copies of it. It has prototype, and you can pay 3 generic and 2 red for it to be a 2/2. So 5 mana for 3 2/2s with trample and haste is at least a B, maybe even a B+. Just adds a bunch of stuff to the board that can do damage right away, and it can even help you stabilize if you're behind because you get 3 bodies out of 1 card. And then obviously, if you can play this later for a massive 9 mana, the 3/4/4 trample haste bodies are going to be even more of a problem. And once again, Power Stones make this more approachable than it might look at first. In the end, I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. So, those are all the red cards in the Brothers War. Tomorrow, I'll be back with a look at all the green cards. If you want to make sure you catch that video, don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to catch up on the rest of the set review, you should see the playlist shortly. Thanks for watching.